So welcome to GED 500. I'm excited to have you all here in class this semester, and also excited that you've decided to take on a higher education degree in the field of education. The world of research, as you know, is a fast-paced and exciting one, and our field is often at the forefront of research and criticism, especially as many of us work in the K-12 sector. This is why it's so critical to be informed about research in education and to be able to evaluate good research as well as faulty research. In the weeks to come, we're going to look at a series of article examples and begin working towards designing excellent research questions, as well as contributing to knowledge that impacts our field. To start, let's watch a short video about scientific studies as presented by John Oliver. You should be able to click on the link to get your video started. If you have any trouble, however, I have placed the video separately in this document where you find Lecture 1. So go ahead and take a look at the video either way. With an emphasis on Chapter 1 in your Creswell text as a means of introducing this topic, we're going to look at the following learning objectives for this lecture. First, we want to define what research is and emphasize its importance. Thinking about the video you just saw, what could you think of as the importance of appropriate scientific studies in general? Next, we will be looking at the process of conducting research. As Creswell mentions, there are 6 steps to this process. We will look at the distinctions between qualitative and quantitative research, and we'll delve into a couple of the ethical issues involved in research. As you'll later see on the slide of ethics, if you haven't already done so, you'll need to complete the human subject certificate at the end of the summer if you haven't already done. And if you are also interested in conducting a research or thesis project, you'll need to complete this. Lastly, for the first session, you'll want to review the skills that researchers often possess, as these are the ones that are going to sustain you on your journey ahead. On its most basic level, research is a process of steps used to collect and analyze information to increase an understanding of a topic or issue. It involves, at the basic level, 3 different steps. First, a person will pose a question about a particular topic of interest. Then, they'll collect and analyze data to answer that question. And finally, they'll present the answer to that question in the form of results or findings. Research is also different than just going to the library and searching for a book or website to answer your question. For example, you might want to see whether a certain learning strategy works well for a group of students. So let's say that you've heard that chunking small groups of text in reading really works well for English language learners who may have difficulty breaking down larger passages. But you would also like to see if it works for your class of students who may have learning disabilities. So you could ask the question, how effective is chunking for students with learning disabilities? So to answer this type of a question, what kinds of data would you need to use? First, you would definitely want to use a group of students with learning disabilities. That would be your population or the group of participants you'd use. Next, you want to find a way to see if chunking is effective for them by administering some sort of assessment. And perhaps to compare, you may give students traditional reading strategies and then some students the chunking strategy. So you would have a group called the control group in that case, and then you would have a group called the treatment or intervention group. Do you know which is which? The control group is the one that doesn't receive any sort of treatment or support. So in this case, the students with the traditional reading strategies aren't getting any additional support. Then some students are getting the chunking strategy, so therefore those students are in the treatment group or intervention group. Then you could see if the group who used chunking performed better on that assessment. We'll discuss this in more detail throughout the semester, but this is just one example of what a research study could look like at its most basic level. There's also something to be said for using multiple measures to get at a question. So, for example, if we wanted to know what is the best way to teach reading, you would probably want to use the following types of data and compare several methods. So, for instance, you could use test scores of your students, oral reading samples, and reading comprehension assessments, and this would give you a more holistic picture of what the students could or could not do. You would also need to consider various types of students to see if the same methods would work for all students. Now, at a more detailed level, there are 6 steps in the research process. First, you want to identify a research problem. As you saw in your reading, the research problem identified had to do with violence in schools. So you'll want to pick a general problem or area of inquiry that you're interested in. Based off of that, you want to go back to research that's already been done and review the literature. So you'll want to look for an additional set of studies that have already covered similar topics to yours, although the questions might be a little bit different. Then you'll want to specify a purpose to your particular study. So what is the purpose of you conducting this particular research? Then you'll want to collect some sorts of data. So data can range from quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, and quasi-experimental studies. So we'll get into what those mean in a little bit later in this lecture. Next, you'll want to analyze and interpret the data that you collect. So what does it all mean? And then finally, you'll want to report your results and evaluate the research that you did through interviews and journals. Next, you're going to analyze and interpret the data. This is done by breaking data down into smaller chunks and then representing the data in different ways. For qualitative research and for my own dissertation project, I did this by using quotes from participants. You then need to explain the data. What does it mean to the average person who's reading your study? Next, you'll report and evaluate the research. Again, this involves deciding on the audiences that are best suited for your study, and then also structuring the report. Now, when you're reading a research article for, say, your literature review section, you'll need to follow the format of the scientific method. So, as shown in Creswell's first chapter at the very end, you'll take a look at the two review articles that are listed there. One is listed as a sample qualitative study, and one is listed as a sample quantitative study. You'll need to go through both of these to understand the differences between the two of these. So there are definitely differences between qualitative and quantitative educational research. For both, the Creswell figure listed in Chapter 1 provides a good example. First, you want to start by looking at research questions. Once you've determined what questions you'll be asking, you can then decide which way you'd like to study your particular area. So for quantitative and qualitative research, both involve different kinds of research designs. For a quantitative design, you're typically looking at experimental, correlational, or survey research. Combined designs, which include qualitative and quantitative, typically use what's called mixed methods or action research. Finally, for qualitative designs, you're typically using things like grounded theory, ethnography, or narrative inquiry. These areas will all be explained in much more detail as we get further into the summer session. For now, it's important to know that when you sample the data, you can use different kinds of sampling based off of the type of study that you do. This is also true for the types of instruments you use to collect your data and how your data is analyzed and interpreted. It also informs your discussion, conclusions, limitations, and your future research. At a basic level, there are several important distinctions between quantitative and qualitative studies. For qualitative research, typically the idea is that it explores a problem or develops a detailed central phenomenon or lived experience. The literature review, which is that evaluation of former studies, tends to play a minor role but justifies the overall problem included in the research. Next, stating a purpose and research questions is more open-ended. This is in order to capture the experiences of participants. For my particular dissertation, I used qualitative research, and in that way I was able to capture the experiences, in my case beliefs, of my participants who were teachers. Then you want to collect data based on words, such as in interviews, or images, such as in photos, from a small number of participants. For example, in my dissertation research, I use a sample size of 5 teachers. For those 5 teachers, I put in a lot of detailed information on interviewing them about their beliefs, giving them journal prompt entries to complete, but in any case, I didn't use a large number of participants. Next, you'll want to analyze data for descriptions and themes and use textual analysis to interpret larger meanings. In qualitative research, the text is the main area of analysis. There's also flexibility from the emerging structures and evaluative criteria, and reflexivity and bias. Qualitative researchers typically believe that nobody can come into a study without a certain level of bias. By contrast, quantitative research tends to describe a problem using trends or a need for an explanation among variables. Quantitative research provides a major role for the literature, so the literature review tends to be much more important for quantitative research. It also justifies the research problem and a need for the study using purpose statement, research questions, and hypothesis. So here again is another distinction between qualitative and quantitative research. Next, quantitative research tends to be specific, narrow, measurable, and observable. Typically, quantitative data is collected numerically, meaning quantitative data researchers use numbers. They're also using instruments that present questions and responses, such as a survey. Analyzing trends is also important for quantitative data research. Analyzing trends, comparing groups, relating variables, all of this is done typically using statistics. Quantitative research also has standard fixed structures and evaluation criteria, and claims that research can be unbiased. As Creswell mentioned, in order to conduct educational research, there's a number of ethical issues you need to be aware of. First, the beneficence of treatment of participants. This means minimizing the risk to individuals and also maximizing good outcomes for them. Next, respecting participants. This means giving participants choices and making sure they're well informed of what the study involves, as well as letting them know that the study is completely voluntary. Finally, there's justice, which involves an analysis of risks and benefits. This is distributed typically through a consent form that is given to participants. The consent form typically lists all of the risks and benefits. Every person that decides to do educational research and has research that involves human subjects has to go through what's called Institutional Review Board Review, or IRB. Every campus has an IRB to protect subjects from unethical treatment. This is used to monitor the adherence to the 3 principles that we discussed. In order to complete your research study, you will need to go through an IRB process. The IRB process is different for different studies. There is, as you see below, a review continuum. This determines the level of risk and the level of review. When the risk is minimal or low, the IRB forms are exempt, which means that you do not have to go through a final review. Expedited, which means that the review is quicker than normal, or full review, which means you'll go through a standard long process review. If you're planning to do a research study involving human subjects, you'll need to do the following things for IRB. First, you'll need to complete the certification of IRB training. The training can be obtained on the following website. You can go to the website using your CSUDH login, and you should be able to complete the training modules and print out a certificate. For this class, you'll need to do this before the end of the session. You'll also have a series of forms, which will provide information about the type of study you'll be conducting. The Form A is a cover sheet, which involves your title and what kinds of things you'll be doing in your study, whereas Form B will include copies of the types of data that you're going to collect. For example, you'll include a copy of a questionnaire or survey that you would distribute to participants. Forms D, E, and F include consent and assent forms, as we discussed before, and information sharing. Next, there'll also be recruitment materials. So for participants, you'll need to find a way to have access to them. So this might be a draft of an email to a participant asking them to be involved in the study. This could be a flyer recruiting participants widely in a school setting. The letters from outside organizations are also needed. This is if you're using another organization for your study. For example, if you want to collect data in a classroom, you'll need to have a principal consent to you collecting that data. All IRB forms, procedures, and the link to the Human Subject Certificate can be found through CSUDH. Check out the site to make sure that you're aware of the types of forms you might need for the type of study you're planning to conduct. There are a variety of skills you'll need as a researcher which you might not be using right now or might not be as familiar with. This includes things like solving puzzles, thinking critically, lengthening your attention span, using library resources in new ways, and, of course, writing, and more editing. When thinking about the types of research you would like to conduct, you need to be familiar with the format of research articles. The research article's typical format includes an abstract, which is a basic summary of the overall study purpose, as well as the brief overview of some of the findings, an introduction which discusses the general problem area, a statement of the research problem or questions to be answered, a review of the literature showing what others have done, and a statement of the hypothesis if you are doing a quantitative study, or it may not be present if you're doing a qualitative study. The last section will then be the references. Now, for your first assignment, as part of your overall research proposal, you'll be writing a research problem statement. In order to do that, Creswell has provided some very good leading questions that will help you to construct one of your problem statements. For example, questions like, what is the problem, issue, or controversy that you want to address? What controversy leads to a need for a study? What is the concern being addressed behind this study? You can use the possible statement, the problem addressed in this study is blank. It is important for you to start by using this sentence and being as clear as possible when you describe your problem statement. It will become a little bit easier as you practice. Oftentimes, beginning researchers tend to confuse problem, purpose, topic, and research questions. To clarify, a topic is the broad subject matter of the study. So for the particular study I used for my dissertation, my overall topic was teacher retention or teacher beliefs. The problem, however, is an issue in education that is addressed in research, which helps to narrow the topic. For my particular research, the problem was that we see a lot of attrition of special education teachers in large urban districts. The purpose of the study is the objective of the study used to address the problem. So the purpose of my study was to understand how beliefs influenced retention. And finally, the research questions narrow the purpose into specific questions that the researcher wants to answer. My particular research question, for example, was, how do beliefs about disability, race, and culture influence urban special education teachers' retention? Sometimes just because a study is a good idea doesn't mean it's necessarily a feasible idea. Deciding if you can conduct a study is also as important as developing the research questions or the statement of problem. To decide if you can conduct a study, you will want to look at gaining access to the people and sites that you need. If this isn't possible, you may need to think of another idea where this is more feasible. You also need to look at time span. Lots of beginning researchers tend to think of broad, large-scale studies that sometimes exceed the time span that you will need. You also need to be aware of the types of resources you'll need to do the particular study. For instance, if you're doing a quantitative study, you'll need to find a software that'll let you develop surveys. Or if I need to find a software that will help you to analyze survey data. You'll also need to think about the types of skills you'll need for a particular type of research. For example, if you decide to do a quantitative study, you'll need to have a basic understanding of statistics. In this class, we'll provide you with some of the basic definitions, but it may be helpful for those of you who are doing quantitative research to look at a couple of additional books or resources for statistics. With a research problem, it is also important to justify why the research problem needs to be studied. To do the justification, you need a combination of a couple of things. First, you can use personal experiences. This can be used in qualitative research, such as a narrative inquiry. For instance, you could think back to a time when you yourself were bullied in school, and then use that as an impetus for a study on bullying. Experiences in the workplace can also be a good justification for both quantitative and qualitative research, as is such of the case in action research. Finally, you can use suggestions made by other researchers. Both are used in quantitative and qualitative research. So looking at former studies, some studies may suggest the need for further research. You can use these ideas as a jumping point for your own research. Now, to end this particular lecture, I have one self-check exercise question for you to think about. Think about the following. Which of the following statements is true? Research means looking up articles in ERIC or in journals in the library. Research means using the teaching method you like best. Research means answering a question with evidence. If you chose the third answer, you chose correctly. Research means answering a question using evidence. As we saw from the six steps that were listed in Creswell, research involves a series of procedures that build on evidence that is collected through data. That concludes Lecture 1 for GED 500. From now, you'll want to go ahead and complete your reflection exercise, comment on a peer, and go ahead and complete the rest of your assignments. If you have any questions in the meantime, please feel free to email me.